I fully appreciate and understand the role of illustration in illuminating a text. In this gallery, most of the images are for fictional prose. In today's reckoning with the nation's systemic racism, which is broader and more complex, there must be an understanding of a holistic perspective of American history. In this grouping of illustrations, imagining the Wild West, there are 2 points that stand out. First is this pairing of images, which is oversimplified as well as romanticized lens to illustrate a layered time in history, a time of how the West was explored and bent to the will of the narrative called the American expansion. As a Black artist immersed in portraying the African American experience, I ask, where are Black people in these images? Why isn't our Black contribution portrayed? 1 in 4 cowboys were of African descent. Black people were homesteaders and town builders. Not only did they face a harsh and unforgiving frontier life, but also dealt with prejudice. The same biases persist today against other citizens of color. Native Americans should be viewed truthfully as people who were first to inhabit the Americas. Movies and newspaper articles and illustrations of the West caused people to think of indigenous people as only being in the West, erasing their history of nation building in the East and Midwestern United States. It is time for equal representation to be addressed for all.
To illustrate is to illuminate, to make visible and to show what's possible. An illustrator is guided by their beliefs, which serve as the light by which they view the world. Those beliefs, formed in the context of their times, can manifest not only in what they choose to show, but how. Illustrations created in a racialized society, like the US, where whiteness has a hegemony over many facets of society, will often tell on itself by virtue of its monolithic gaze. For example, Black figures are shown as cartoonish, dehumanized stereotypes. If not outright mocked, they are often hidden, obscured in space by more prominent white figures. They are objects that exist on the margins of the image itself. Their labor, even within the artifice of a picture, is used to service and uphold a specific lifestyle. Remember that contextually, the images around you are popular images of a caste society. They were commissioned by businesses of repute, painted by working professionals, and consumed by mainstream culture. As an illustrator working today, I'm increasingly mindful of the life my images have in the greater public sphere beyond my intent. I acknowledge that images have power and that their impact demands responsibility.
I'm an illustrator and educator with formal training in photography and drawing. Both disciplines have informed my work as an illustrator. Before college, I made art and took notice of visual things, yet it was during college that I began to look closely. What I noticed among the notable works was a void. Could it be that only white men and their work were good enough to be named, respected, and valued? In photography, I looked to Julia Margaret Cameron, Margaret Burke White, Berenice Abbott, and later Diane Arbus and Mary Ellen Mark to address basic gender limits I'd observed, but their work only addressed part of what was missing for me. When I began to illustrate and look closely at what was heralded as remarkable in illustration, I saw beautiful images reflecting experiences that were both familiar and skewed. As with many of the illustrations on display at the museum, A disparity in gender and in identity and equity exists through the practitioners and their images. I think about this as a museum goer, a practitioner and educator. Illustration is about telling stories. Whose stories will be told? Illustrations are narratives that communicate ideas to people and help us look closer at how society is depicted. Who will now and tomorrow have the privilege to be the storyteller? And will we see their work widely published and hung on walls like these?
Whose truth do these illustrations present? What story do they tell us about the racial dynamics in America? I see in these images the hint of uncomfortable intimacy. It's in the prodding touch on the shoulder from a woman to her attendant. I see it in the imagined hands of the shadowy presence that is holding the balance of precariously placed children. It is there in the careful construction of a toy meant for commercial consumption. In service. That's how race is imagined. A sidekick. In the shadows. Moving out and away by request. Only centered to appeal to the consumer. And even then, the rendering is of a chef in service of your palatable desires.
Illustration is a uniquely powerful medium that has directly persuaded perspectives on race and culture in the United States and worldwide for centuries. These artists have visually responded to events and stories and attached their perceptions and point of view to these images. Many white artists and illustrators have omitted Black life or relegated the subservient Black figure to more obscure roles in their images. Black illustrators have changed perceptions of Black life through their dedication to visually telling a more positive and realistic story. As a Black illustrator and storyteller growing up in Virginia in the 70s, seeing myself through Black images in mainstream print media was virtually non-existent. The Black experience was never talked about in the education system from elementary school through higher education. It is a great privilege to have the skill set to visually express oneself and transform words and thoughts into illustrative imagery. With that privilege comes the responsibility of the power and influence through persuasion and communication to speak to mass audiences. To understand the power and impact illustrators have on society's perception of non-whites is to study the history of race and its link to illustrated imagery. You might not see the problematic perspectives on race that these images connote. Look deeper and consider how these illustrations reflect our society's views of race, past and present.
To look at images of love in illustration history is to find an abundance of white heterosexual couples engaged in a limited range of activities. Courting rituals, aspirational consumer spending, men responding to women in danger. If a conflict arises, the performance of narrowly defined gender roles usually figures prominently in the resolution. As a gay person, can I find a depiction of myself in these galleries? The short answer is no, not really. But sometimes, viewing historical work through contemporary eyes, elements emerge that can queer an image. Humor is often involved. For example, the title of Andrew Loomis's piece, Nora, he said huskily, is funny to me because including the description of the man's voice is unexpected, and so is the word huskily. The queering of the image occurs because the title creates an off-balance contrast with the man in the illustration, who is impeccably dressed and groomed in a cosmopolitan setting. Loomis gives the man prominent lips, likely to focus our gaze on the impending kiss, but in doing so invokes a visual language traditionally used to signify feminine beauty. The description of his voice in the title butches him up, offsetting the less stereotypically masculine visual signifiers in the illustration. For me, This perceived overcompensation tips this piece into the category of camp. A general definition of camp is the celebration of the artificial and the exaggerated. In gay culture, camp material has historically been embraced as a way to point out, deconstruct, and collectively laugh at arbitrary expectations related to the expression of gender and sexuality. So, while I can't pick out an intentional depiction of a gay person in these galleries or a fellow openly gay illustrator to whom I could look for inspiration, I can gravitate toward and commiserate with Nora's well-dressed, huskily voiced friend, a two-dimensional construction himself, but a slightly queer one.
These illustrations reflect the experience of Black women and men being integral parts of society and yet being second class and invisible at the same time. The differences in skin color, hair texture, dress, and facial expressions catch the eye upon first glance. The Black woman in the first image is intentionally placed behind the white women and girls. Her full body is not present and her facial features aren't fully developed with detail. The absence and hidden figure imagery exemplifies Black women's lack of power, as she is barely visible as opposed to the white women, who are detailed with imagery, femininity, and personality. In the second image, the Black woman is dressed as a servant and appears inferior to her white counterpart in the picture. As a Black woman, the illustrations remind me of Black women's invisibility in American spaces, despite their many remarkable contributions. As an educator, the images make me consider how students could analyze how power and privilege are evoked through visual imagery in this collection. All the images reveal a clear focus of whiteness, while Blackness appears as an accessory or additive piece to each image. This exemplifies race in America quite clearly from many decades ago, but still echoes of it are very present today.